What if I told you that some of the deepest pain we carry comes not from what happened to us, but from how long we've gone without feeling truly loved? You and I, we are not that different. Every person you pass today is carrying something. Maybe it's an old wound that hasn't fully healed. Maybe it's the stress of a long week or an invisible fear that makes the nights feel longer. And sometimes it's just a lingering sense of loneliness. And this is where love shows its strength not as a grand gesture, but as a gentle antidote to suffering. When a person feels loved, truly felt and held, their inner world begins to shift. The fear loses its grip. The loneliness quiets down. Empathy, too, is a form of love. Not just an idea or a virtue, but a biological invitation to connect. When we look into another's face and allow ourselves to feel with them, not for them, but with them, something changes. Our bodies respond. The right hemisphere of our brain begins to synchronize with theirs. A natural chemical is released. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, but in truth, it's the messenger of trust. Oxytocin helps us feel safe, seen, and supported. It reduces the stress hormone cortisol that builds up during times of threat, fear, or emotional isolation. In a world saturated with cortisol, oxytocin is like fresh air. Have you ever noticed how just one kind word, one sincere glance, one touch from someone who genuinely cares can soften your entire nervous system? That's not just emotional, it's physiological. The same hormone that supports childbirth and breastfeeding also plays a vital role in how we form human bonds, how we cope with hardship, and how we begin to feel whole again. And here's the beautiful part. It doesn't take grand gestures to activate it. Looking someone in the eye, speaking with gentleness, asking how they really are, and waiting long enough to hear the answer. These small acts awaken something in us. They awaken something in the other person too. They say, "You are not alone." And in that moment, both hearts feel less burdened. Even science is beginning to understand this more deeply. Oxytocin doesn't just reduce anxiety. It protects the heart. It helps regulate cholesterol. It nurtures emotional resilience. And from the very beginning of life, we need it. From the moment we arrive in this world, we are wired to seek not just food and shelter, but presence, care, and connection. The way we receive these early on shapes our ability to handle stress, to trust others, and to recover from adversity. It's not about having a perfect life. It's about having someone to walk through the imperfect moments with. And in many ways, what defines a life isn't what we've collected or accomplished, but how we've given, how we've loved, how we've shown up for someone else. So I often find myself asking this simple question, not only to those I support, but to myself as well. How much of your energy goes into truly seeing the people around you? Your partner, your children, your friends, the person behind the counter, the neighbor you pass by. Do you know their stories? What worries keep them up at night? Or have you been so consumed by your own pain that the world outside becomes a blur? There's no judgment here, just a gentle invitation to come back, to invest in people, not with perfection, but with attention. Invest your time, invest your presence, look them in the eye. Listen not just with your ears, but with your full self. When two people meet in that space, open, real, unguarded, something ancient and beautiful happens. The mirror neurons in our brains light up. Connection becomes possible, and healing begins. For children, this is even more profound. When a child is looked at, not from above, but from eye level, from the ground they stand on, something shifts inside them. Imagine kneeling down, aligning your gaze with theirs, and for a moment, letting the world stop. You're not trying to change their feelings. You're simply trying to feel with them that kind of presence. It speaks louder than any advice. What children need, what we all need, is not empty promises of, "I'm here if you need me," said while distracted, said without heart. What makes the difference is presence. Real, living presence. The kind that says, "You matter. Your pain matters. I'm not afraid of it." And yet, here we are, in the most connected era in human history, feeling more alone than ever. Because technology may connect devices, but it doesn't always connect hearts. The pace of our lives moves fast, but pain moves slowly. And so often, it gets left behind, unseen, unfelt, unspoken. We live in a culture that subtly rewards detachment, that tells us not to feel too much, that if someone is in pain, it's better to look away than to be affected. And there's some logic in that, because the truth is, when we open ourselves to another's suffering, we risk touching our own. Think about someone close to you who might be hurting. Maybe they mention their child, their parent, something at work, and as they speak, a part of you tenses. Something inside stirs. Maybe it's a familiar ache. Maybe it's something unresolved. And without realizing it, you begin to pull away, not from them, but from the feelings they awaken in you. We don't always do this consciously. Sometimes protecting ourselves looks like staying busy. Sometimes it sounds like changing the subject. And sometimes it's simply silence because we don't know what to say. But underneath it all is often fear. The fear of feeling too much. The fear of carrying someone else's pain home with us. Especially in a world like ours, where the news alone can overwhelm, where suffering is broadcasted daily in high definition, and when the weight of global sorrow feels too heavy, it's tempting to surround ourselves with people who seem fine, who smile and never crack, who don't remind us of the battles we're secretly fighting too. As someone who has sat with many forms of pain, both my own and that of others, I know this vulnerability well. There have been moments when a patient shares something so raw, so honest, that it echoes within my own memories, my own wounds. And I've had to pause, to breathe, to remember that I too am human, that healing doesn't mean immunity. This is something all caregivers must face, whether you're a therapist, a nurse, a teacher, or simply someone who loves deeply. When you are called to care, you are also called to feel. But feeling deeply doesn't mean drowning. It means knowing your waters, knowing where your limits lie, and honoring them. That's why self-awareness is not a luxury, it's a necessity. We can only hold space for others to the extent that we've learned to hold space for ourselves. And sometimes that means stepping back before we reach empty. Other times it means recognizing the signs of compassion, fatigue, the quiet exhaustion of giving from a well that hasn't been filled. I often tell people you don't need to fix the pain of the world, but you can be a witness, you can be a presence, and in many cases that's more powerful than any solution. Some of the deepest wounds I've seen have been carved by cruelty, by betrayal, by humiliation, by being treated as less than human. And these wounds don't heal with time alone. They need contact. Kindness, the slow, steady light of someone who says, I see you, and I'm not leaving. Of course, that kind of love isn't easy. It asks a lot of us. It may cost us comfort. It may open doors we thought were long closed. But it is also how we grow. It is how we turn pain into something else, into meaning, into depth, into connection. I remember a patient who, after years of striving and achieving, decided to pause her life and go volunteer in a remote village in India. She wasn't looking to escape her pain. She was looking to meet it. And in meeting others who were suffering, she didn't feel drained. She felt alive, not because she had all the answers, but because she allowed herself to be there, fully present, human. And that presence changed her. It gave her strength she didn't know she had. It gave her clarity. And when she returned home, she was not the same. She carried with her a kind of quiet certainty, a knowing that even in chaos there is purpose, that even in the rubble there are seeds. When we allow ourselves to be moved, truly moved, by the pain of others, we often discover the parts of ourselves that are still waiting to be met. Sometimes offering a moment of attention feels natural, almost invisible in its simplicity. It could be listening, really listening to the woman at the checkout stand as she shares a worry you didn't ask for, but received anyway. Or perhaps it's holding space once again for a coworker who's spoken of the same struggle with their son for the 24th time. There are days when helping looks like tending to a sick relative, visiting someone who barely notices you're there, but you go anyway, not for praise, but because you feel something inside says this matters. When these moments of connection are chosen with awareness, they soften us. They remind us we're human, stitched into the fabric of one another. And yet, when we help, without checking in with ourselves, when we offer care out of guilt or compulsion, we begin to fray. This isn't just about family or friendship. It lives in classrooms, offices, hospitals, even boardrooms. I remember once in the early days of speaking in corporate settings, someone asked if it might be strange to bring in someone like me to talk about emotions in a room full of people who were trained to hide them. And I smiled because I knew the emotional life doesn't disappear at work. It just goes underground. For so long, feelings were seen as inconvenient at best and shameful at worst, especially in professional environments. Empathy was a whisper, vulnerability a flaw, but that's slowly shifting. More leaders are beginning to recognize that when a workplace makes space for emotion, something surprising happens. The atmosphere changes, communication deepens, even productivity rises, not because people are being pushed harder, but because they feel seen. Behind every title is a nervous system. Behind every to-do list is someone trying to hold it all together. And when someone feels at least somewhat at peace inside, their ability to relate to their work and to the people around them transforms. Of course, we know that no job is perfect. There's no utopia here. But when there's a little alignment, when there's connection between who we are and what we do, something begins to feel less forced, a little more whole. And this is where emotional intelligence isn't just a nice idea. It becomes a bridge, not a fix, not a strategy, but a bridge between people who long to be understood and environments that often forget to ask how anyone is really doing. Because in the end, empathy is not a technique, it's an offering. And love is not just reserved for the romantic. It lives in everyday moments, in the patient pause, during a tough conversation, in the glance that says, "I see you," in the silent presence we extend when there's nothing left to say. Love wears many faces. It can show up in friendship, in shared beliefs, in the way we treat strangers we'll never meet again. But at its root, love begins in one quiet place: how we relate to ourselves. And that's where the journey turns inward, the way we speak to ourselves, that unending inner monologue that runs beneath the surface of our days. It shapes everything. It's not just background noise. It is the script from which we live. Some people call it the default mode network. Others just know it as the voice that won't go quiet. It remembers everything. It replays old fears, doubts stories. Sometimes it whispers self-doubt so subtly we don't even notice we're agreeing with it. But here's the truth: that voice, harsh or kind, changes depending on what's happening inside us. If I'm grounded, if I've made some space for rest and reflection, that voice becomes softer. It supports me. It doesn't rush to judge. But when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm carrying too much pain I haven't named, that voice turns sharp. It criticizes, it sabotages, and slowly it chips away at my sense of worth. That's why healing often begins with self-recognition, not with affirmations or forced positivity, but with the gentle practice of looking at ourselves without attack, of holding our humanity even when we've messed up. This isn't weakness. It's the first act of inner strength to look inward without turning against ourselves. To say without excuse or punishment, "Yes, I've struggled. Yes, I've hurt, and I'm still here." This is the foundation of what many call self-esteem, but I see it less as a measurement and more as a quiet knowing. It's the space between who I thought I'd be and who I've come to be after all the trials. It's not perfection, it's presence. When I can accept myself, flaws, contradictions, and all, I begin to experience a different kind of peace. Not the peace of everything being right, but the peace of no longer needing to fight myself. And when that voice inside no longer attacks, something shifts. I start to notice joy in ordinary things. I laugh more. I listen differently. I stop needing to prove so much because I've come home to myself. But if that inner voice is ruled by perfectionism, if it constantly says, "You're not enough," then no success, no praise, no relationship will fill the emptiness it leaves behind. That's why real healing doesn't begin outside. It begins with how we relate to the parts of ourselves that feel unworthy of love. And maybe, just maybe, as we soften toward ourselves, we find that we can love others without losing who we are in the process. Because love, in its truest form, doesn't demand that we disappear. It invites us to show up as we are. And in that showing up, something sacred returns the right to be human. There's something about falling in love that gently distorts the edges of reality. Suddenly, the rain doesn't sting the same way. The traffic, the noise, the sharpness of someone's tone at work, they all seem to fade as if seen through a fogged window. When love enters quietly, or sometimes all at once, it alters the way we experience the world around us. It doesn't fix what's wrong, but it makes it feel lighter. Even pain seems to echo differently. In the early stages of love, we often speak of a spark, something instant electric. And for some, that spark changes everything. There's a kind of enchantment, a sudden pull towards someone we barely know, and yet something inside whispers, this could be it. People call it love at first sight. Maybe you've lived it, or maybe you've seen it unfold in someone else's story. So improbable and yet so convincing. Two people meet. Something unspoken passes between them. And within days or even hours, they make decisions that alter the course of their lives. What happens in that moment isn't just magic, it's deeply biological. Our brains flood with signals, desire, fascination, anticipation. We're not analyzing or comparing or evaluating. We're simply drawn in. The gaze, the body language, the sound of a laugh, it all becomes part of a powerful equation we don't consciously control. In those first moments, the bond is largely physical. Visual attraction plays a dominant role, which is why this experience tends to happen more often when there's strong aesthetic appeal, something that catches the eye and invites the heart to follow. But that's just the beginning. Because as captivating as that first spark can be, what we call love in those moments is often something else, something tender, intense, but still surface level. Real love, the kind that endures, asks for time. It asks to be known. It requires patience, not just passion. It's true that some relationships do begin with that blinding flash and go on to become something strong, something lasting. I've seen it. But even in those rare cases, the spark was never enough on its own. What followed was effort, mutual commitment, resilience, and the slow building of trust, often through difficult seasons. Love isn't just about what we feel when everything is easy. It's about how we choose to remain when things get hard. There's a saying I once heard from someone wise in the ways of the heart. It goes something like this: when love begins, it can blind us, but when it ends, it sees everything. And as much as that sounds poetic, there's a real neurological truth behind it. When we fall in love, the part of the brain responsible for long-term thinking, decision-making, and caution, the prefrontal cortex, goes quiet. It's as if the volume is turned down on our inner voice that usually asks, is this wise? Is this safe? In that state, the emotional centers of the brain take over. The amygdala, which typically scans for danger and helps us regulate emotional risk, also loses some of its power. The body's entire alert system softens, and with it, our awareness of potential problems fades into the background. So we ignore the gaps, the inconvenient truths, the differences in age, geography, relationship status, the red flags that might have stopped us in any other situation seem oddly unimportant. This doesn't mean love is foolish. It just means love has its own chemistry. What the science shows us is that the intense emotional and physical state associated with new love, the euphoria, the tunnel vision, tends to last for a certain period. on average about 17 months. After that, the spell begins to lift. The brain recalibrates, and we begin to see the other person not just as a projection of our longing, but as they truly are. This is where many relationships either deepen or fall apart, because only when the haze clears can we truly choose the other person, not just the feeling they give us. Only then can love become something steady. That's why, when emotions are running high, it can help to wait. Not forever, but long enough for the mind to come back online. Long enough to allow the heart and the head to meet again in the same room. Only then can we decide honestly, consciously, what kind of relationship we're entering into and whether it has the roots to grow. People who live with intense passion often move quickly. They leap, they fall hard. Maybe you've done that yourself. Maybe you've found yourself swept into something beautiful, only to discover later that the ground beneath it wasn't as solid as you'd hoped. And yet, even in those moments, there's nothing to regret, because every time we love, even imperfectly, we learn something about what we need, about where we still hurt, about where we are ready to open, and where we still need to heal. Love will always awaken something in us. Sometimes it awakens a hunger to be seen. Other times, a longing to be rescued. And occasionally, it reveals a tenderness we forgot we had. But love, real love, is never rushed. It arrives in layers. It reveals itself slowly. And if we're willing to wait, to stay present, and to be honest with ourselves and the other, it can become a space where both people are seen, not just desired. What is it I'm really longing for? When a new relationship begins, especially one that feels electrifying, we may find ourselves swept up in it. The spark, the chemistry, the thrill of being wanted, they can feel like a flood washing over everything else. And sometimes in that flood, we lose sight of our own footing. You see, when we're caught in the heat of early passion, the parts of our brain that help us think clearly, that help us slow down, weigh risk, notice patterns, they go dim. That's not a flaw in character. It's biology. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for careful judgment and long-term planning, becomes quiet. What takes over is the more primal system, the emotional brain, the one wired for intensity, closeness, survival. And when this happens, we may begin making decisions not from a place of clarity, but from longing, from a hunger that says, I've waited long enough. I deserve this now. I remember someone, let's call her Susanna, a thoughtful, grounded woman with a deeply generous heart. She had dreamed for years of finding someone to share her life with. And one day, through a screen, she met someone. He lived far away, but within days, he was in her city, taking her out to dinner, playing her songs on his guitar, telling her the things she had longed to hear. It felt magical. In 2 weeks, she was rearranging furniture, planning his move into her home, imagining a future together. When I gently suggested she pause, take a breath, she looked at me with eyes full of joy and urgency. I don't want to wait. I finally feel something true. And how could I not understand that? How could I not recognize that tone? The voice of someone who has been starving for connection, who finally tastes sweetness and wants more before it disappears. The need to be loved can be so powerful it overrides all other needs for safety, for balance, even for self-respect. That's not a mistake. That's the pain of unmet connection finally being fed, even if just for a moment. But months later, when the rush had passed and the reality settled in, she called me heartbroken. The man who had once seemed like the answer was now someone she barely recognized. There had been things she hadn't seen, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. He hadn't let go of past entanglements. He wasn't as present, as available as he once seemed. And in her words, I heard both sorrow and clarity. My brain couldn't see it then. That's the thing. When the emotional brain leads, the thinking brain waits in the background. It's not that we don't know what's happening. It's that we can't feel it fully, not yet. But this isn't just about love. It's also about how we use intimacy to fill the gaps within us. Because not every connection is rooted in love. Sometimes what we call love is simply the desire to escape, to lose ourselves in another body, another story, another set of promises. Sexual desire is not wrong. It's not shameful. It's deeply human. But when used unconsciously, when used as a way to fill silence or avoid loneliness, it becomes something else, a distraction, a performance, a mask for pain we haven't yet named. There are people who seek closeness, not for mutual intimacy, but for conquest, for the pride of being wanted, for the story they get to tell themselves when someone says yes. And in those encounters, feelings are meant to stay buried, because to feel too much in casual intimacy means risking hurt. So we numb. We convince ourselves it doesn't matter, that it's just fun, just physical, no strings, but the body keeps score. And for many, that just physical encounter leaves behind an echo sadness, confusion, a sense of being used, even if everything was agreed upon. There's a reason for that. The chemical released during intimacy, oxytocin, is a bonding hormone. It builds connection even when we try to suppress it. And for many, especially women, it's not so easy to separate the act from the emotion. So even if we tell ourselves it's casual, the heart may disagree. One day, the calls stop, the other person moves on, and suddenly we're sitting with a sadness we didn't expect. A heartbreak we didn't give ourselves permission to feel because we told ourselves we didn't care. But we did. A large study from 2013 explored the emotional impact of casual sex. And what they found surprised many. Not only did people report higher levels of anxiety and depression afterward, but they also described more difficulty in forming lasting, meaningful relationships later on. The moments meant to free them, and it left them feeling more alone. I wasn't surprised when I came across that study. The link between casual sex and emotional heaviness, it's something I've witnessed again and again. There are people who describe their sex lives as active, exciting even, and yet somewhere beneath it all, there's sadness, an ache they can't quite explain. Real love isn't fast, it isn't loud, it doesn't arrive in a flash, it takes time, and it makes us vulnerable. When we love, we open the door to being hurt. But when we only seek sex, we try to keep the door closed. No risk, no exposure, just the surface. And still it hurts, because sexuality can bring deep joy, but it can also stir pain. In therapy, I've sat with people who carry trauma in their bodies, people for whom Physical closeness feels confusing, even frightening. Many of those wounds began early in childhood, where love was inconsistent or conditional, and later they show up in how we try to connect. Some turn to sex, hoping to feel held, touched, seen if only for a moment. But we can't separate the body from the mind. Not really. What touches the skin often reaches deeper. The nervous system feels it all. And when we ignore that, we begin to carry the cost silently. That's why love matters. Not just the idea of it, but the way it helps us heal. The way it holds space for who we are and not just what we offer. But we tend to love the way we were loved. And when our early stories were full of absence or pain, we may chase the same without even knowing it. So if you find yourself in patterns that leave you hurt, don't judge yourself, but don't ignore it either. Healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about recognizing what we carry and learning to choose differently when we're ready. Let desire be your fire, but let love be your guide. So maybe today, after everything you've heard, you'll take a moment to breathe, not to fix anything, not to figure it all out, just to feel, to ask yourself, not with judgment, but with tenderness, what part of me is still waiting to be loved? And if that question stirs something inside you, let it. Because the truth is, you don't have to go searching for love in all the loud places. Sometimes it begins with simply noticing your own heart and meeting it where it's been aching the longest. Thank you for being here with me, for your presence, for your honesty, for your courage to listen even to the quiet parts of your story. If this video spoke to something inside you, I invite you to come back. We'll keep exploring this together, slowly, gently, one truth at a time. Until then, take care of yourself the way you would care for someone you truly love, because that someone is you.